This talk is going to be based off of my first book monograph called Virtue and Meaning. I'll talk a little bit about that shortly, but sort of summarizes some of those themes. And the PowerPoint, have a fair amount of text that I will just read off of. I find that easier to follow if people can kind of see the text before them. And I think it's helpful, just for following along. So I want to begin with this quotation from David Wiggins, who says, "Even now, in an age not much given to mysticism, there are people who ask, what is the meaning of life? They suppose that questions like that of life's meaning must be among the central questions of moral philosophy. The question of life's meaning is not at the center of moral philosophy as we now have it. Philosophy has put happiness in the place that should have been occupied in moral philosophy by meaning." So I'm fundamentally in agreement with the sentiment, Wiggins' sentiment about that the question of life's meaning should be among the central questions of moral philosophy. And in my book, Virtue and Meaning, a neo-Aristotelian perspective, which came out with Cambridge in 2020, I seek to show what it is like to treat the question of life's meaning as a central question of moral philosophy. I will discuss some key elements of this account here. So while I work within the Aristotelian tradition, I'm dissatisfied with the flatness and the dominant contemporary approach. And this is an approach that is associated with Rosalind Hursthouse, Philippa Foot, Alistair McIntyre, and some of his later work. And so what we can see in this is that it emphasizes a disengaged standpoint rather than an engaged standpoint. In other words, it emphasizes an observational standpoint as contrasted with a participative standpoint. And you see this in the way that it stresses an analogy between human flourishing and the flourishing of other living things. And thereby, I think it overlooks many of the meanings by which we live and after which we seek. So you see this, for instance, in Rosalind Hursthouse, who says that when we do ethics, we're doing something similar to what the botanists and ethologists do when they determine whether or not a plant or an animal, a non-human animal, is a good specimen of its kind. So I think this account, again, overlooks many of the meanings we seek in life. In another way to put this is that it fails to account properly for our distinctive nature as the meaning-seeking animal, and is thus offered an overly disenchanted understanding of our human form of life. And what I mean by disenchanted here just is this sense of a loss of meaning. I think all neo-Aristotelians have been concerned to respond to the problem of disenchantment as it comes about in the supposed fact-value divide, but so they seek to endorse a kind of natural normativity. However, I think in taking this sort of like observer standpoint, they end up losing many of the distinctive things of our human form of life as understood from within. I seek to overcome this constriction and argue for a re-enchanted Aristotelian perspective. That is, I aim to give better recognition to the meanings by which we live and after which we seek. So the key thesis of the book is that any adequate neo-Aristotelian ethical perspective must take account of the way in which human beings are fundamentally and distinctively the meaning-seeking animal. And there's three aspects of this meaning-seeking that I want to mention here that'll be important for this talk. So first, it is distinctive of our human form of life, again, understood from within, that we seek meaning in life, and in particular, strong evaluative meaning. That is, meaning or value that involves qualitative distinction, for example, between the higher and lower, the noble and base, sacred and profane, and so on, and specifies that with which we ought to orient that we ought to be concerned, and that toward which we ought to orient our lives. Again, for example, the higher, the noble, the sacred, etc. Secondly, since these strong evaluative meanings, the noble, the sacred, and so on, require a certain life orientation, there is also a concern here with a meaningful life. That is, the concern is with the overall meaning of our lives, or you might say our deathbed reflections. So on reflection, can we look back on our lives, or even anticipating moving forward, can we say we've lived a meaningful life? And then thirdly, it is also distinctive of our human form of life that we can be concerned, and often are concerned, with the meaning of life. That is, we are concerned with how our lives fit into the grand scheme of things, and whether there is a cosmic or ultimate source of meaning to which we must align our lives. I seek to show how this concern for the meaning of life is rightly connected to a concern for meaning in life and a meaningful life. So again, the three aspects of meaning seeking are seeking meaning in life, then they're seeking a meaningful life. So as a whole, as looking at one's whole life from a whole life perspective. And then lastly, this discussion of the meaning of life. So I want to argue that a neo-Aristotelian perspective needs to incorporate each of these aspects of meaning seeking. So it is interesting that you, in many ways, there's this literature on meaning in life that sort of cropped up around, for instance, Susan Wolf, Thaddeus Metz, and others that has, been gaining a lot of traction. But you also have, this sort of growing popularity of Aristotelian virtue ethics, Aristotelianism in general. But oftentimes, there's not a lot of engagement between these different perspectives. And so partly I'm trying to bring out, I think, ways that thinking in terms of meaning in life helps us, to sort of address certain issues in virtue ethics. So this brings us back to that quotation from Wiggins. And so I think Wiggins is right that moral philosophers have often focused on happiness rather than meaning. However, I want to suggest that there is a conception of happiness available to us that is equivalent to a strong evaluative conception of a meaningful life. So some sense of a normatively higher, more noble, more fulfilling kind of life. And so I think this is the sort of understanding of happiness that we need, particularly if we're going to address the ancient philosophical question of why be moral or why be virtuous, right? And I think, contemporary Aristotelians sort of puzzle over how Aristotle's idea of eudaimonia should be properly translated. I mean, in many of the translations, it's translated as happiness, and I think for many people, happiness today has sort of connotations of something subjective or a kind of desire satisfaction account. And certainly that's one way one could understand happiness, but in terms of sort of the ultimate end of everything we're seeking, I don't think that's the best understanding. So many Aristotelians have been inclined to translate it as flourishing. And again, where flourishing is understood as sort of equivalent to the flourishing of other living things and plants and animals. But I think that also comes up short. You see that, for instance, in certain passages from Aristotle. For instance, he says, we regard neither ox nor horse nor any other kind of animal as happy, eudaimon, for none of them can share in this sort of noble activity. So that suggests that Aristotle doesn't think flourishing can be understood completely. It's very different for human beings than it would be for animals. So for us, virtue aims at the noble, and it's this noble activity that is constitutive of our happiness. And I think we get something close. I mean, obviously, Aristotle doesn't talk about meaning in life. I mean, that's a very modern way of talking. But I think we have to speak sort of in the currency of our times. I think we see something like this towards the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle says happiness is not found in amusement, for it would be absurd if the end were amusement, all of our lifelong efforts and sufferings aimed at amusing ourselves. Rather, it seems correct to amuse ourselves so that we can do something serious. There's a correlative passage in Eudemian Ethics 1.5, where Aristotle is raising the question of whether it's good to have been born, right? And he says, if it just were about seeking pleasure, then we'd have to say it would be better never to have been. But he says, citing Anaxagoras, we are here to contemplate the order of the universe and the heavens, and this is what makes life worth living, right? And so you can see, Aristotle is very much concerned with these sorts of questions about, whether it's good to be here, the sort of questions that today we capture under discussions of meaning in life or the meaning of life. And so I think it makes sense to, from a neo-Aristotelian standpoint, to think in terms of, think of happiness in terms of a meaningful life, is that ultimate end of what we're seeking in our action, and also that which, that conception of life that can make us feel that it's good to be here, that it's good to have been born, right? So we're going to come back to that. I'm going to call that the issue of cosmodicy, whether we can justify life in the world as worth living in the face of suffering and evil. So that's going to be an important issue. So not theodicy, which is a justification of God's ways, and that's a special problem for theists, and theists have given many different responses to that. But the common problem for everyone, theist or not, is the problem of cosmodicy, the justification of the world or life in the world is worthwhile and meaningful in the face of evil and suffering. So just to connect back with the meaning in life discourse, So probably most familiar to people is Susan Wolf's work, where she wants to talk about these three dimensions of value: meaning, morality, and happiness. And Thaddeus Metz also talks in these terms, where they seek to make a case for meaningfulness as a third dimension of value that is important for a good human life, along with happiness and morality, by showing that although these different dimensions of value can overlap, they need not do so. So the idea here is that one can have a meaningful life but be unhappy and or immoral or vicious. One can have a happy life but have a life lacking in meaning and or be immoral or vicious. And one can be moral or virtuous but be unhappy and lack meaning. So the idea is you have these three distinct categories: meaning, morality, and happiness. They can overlap, but they can also come apart, right? So that's the basic idea. Against these views, I will seek to show the connections between virtue, happiness, and meaningfulness. And I also want to challenge the attempt to separate the question of meaning in life from the question of the meaning of life. So Susan Wolf, for instance, will talk about how we can live meaningful lives in a meaningless universe. And I think there's certain challenges that I want to bring to the fore. Okay, so I want to now look at the relationship between virtue and happiness and three accounts of this. So again, the basic idea that I want to put forward is that we should understand happiness as a meaningful life and see virtue as constitutive of this. But before getting to that account, I want to begin first with what I call the instrumentalist account. On the instrumentalist account, the virtues are a means for achieving other things we want, the attainment of which is thought to bring happiness for oneself, understood in subjectivist or desire satisfaction terms. So this is actually Philippa Foot's sort of first major position on the question of the relationship between virtue and happiness. She went through a number of different positions over the course of her career, but we can see this in her early essay, Moral Beliefs, which was published in 1958, 1959. We can consider here the phrase that honesty is the best policy, where someone thinks that being honest will help them to get other good things. So it might be hard, for instance, to run a business if one isn't honest, if people don't trust you. Another way that this idea of this instrumentalist account has been developed is to say that virtue is a best bet for achieving happiness in the long run. And we see that sort of view is put forward in Rosalind Hursthouse book on virtue ethics. So I think there's two objections to this instrumentalist account. The first is that it does not provide us with a strong basis for the life of virtue, since it cannot rule out that for some people, at least on some occasions, it would be more beneficial to be vicious. Secondly, it does not provide us with good reasons for acting virtuously. We should act virtuously, as Aristotle puts it, for its own sake, because the virtuous actions are inherently good or worthwhile. That is, they are inherently noble to call on. So another account is a constitutive account, and I want to talk about two versions of the constitutive account. The first version is what I call the weak evaluative version. So weak evaluation as contrasted with strong evaluation, and this is terminology that I take over from Charles Taylor. In weak evaluation, we judge something to be good simply because it's desired, right? So like a preference for a flavor of ice cream. If you like chocolate ice cream and someone else likes strawberry ice cream, no one's blameworthy for not liking your favorite kind of ice cream. That contrasts with strong evaluation, where something is judged to be good not because it's desired, but because it ought to be desired. It's something you ought to care about. So for instance, again, the virtues are things we ought to care about even if we don't. But on a weak evaluative view, the virtues are constitutive of happiness. That is, virtue is its own reward if being virtuous is something you happen to care about. And this is sort of Foot's middle position, which she defends in her essay, Morality as a System of Hypothetical Imperatives. So obviously that terminology, hypothetical imperatives, has Kantian resonance. So Kant distinguishes between categorical imperatives and hypothetical imperatives, where categorical imperatives are things that we ought to care about, even if we don't. So it has that strong evaluative aspect, whereas hypothetical imperatives are imperatives based upon whether or not we in fact desire something. So if you, again, as Foote will put it at this period in her career, if being virtuous is something you happen to care about, then you should do the virtues. You should, exercise the virtues, because that will make you happy. So again, I think there's two main objections here. First, this does not account for the typical experience of the demands of virtue. For example, justice, kindness, courage, and so forth, where they're experienced as being categorical. That is, these normative demands are seen as being there in any case, whether or not we're responsive to them, to quote from John McDowell. Second, if we come to understand our commitment to the life of virtue as being entirely contingent on what we happen to care about, then this can have a deflationary effect and undermine this commitment to the life of virtue. So the view I put forward, I call the strong evaluative version of the constitutive account. On this view, the virtues are modes of proper responsiveness to strong goods. For example, virtue itself is realizing what is noblest in our humanity, human dignity in others, could be, some understanding of the natural world around us. God, it can be a strong good as something we ought to be properly responsive to. And such proper responsiveness is constitutive of our happiness, understood in terms of a normatively higher, nobler, more fulfilling, more meaningful form of life. So the idea here is that you take a virtue, for instance, like justice, as being a mode of proper responsiveness to the dignity of others and giving them their due. In being properly responsive to human dignity, this is going to be constitutive of a sense of fulfillment. So being a just person involves being properly responsive to the value in others. Similarly, virtues also realize something noble in our own humanity. And in realizing what's best in our humanity, we find a sense of fulfillment. It's just what it is for those goods to be goods for us, is that we find fulfillment in being properly responsive to them. Okay, so one of the questions that comes up in Foote's later work then is whether virtue and happiness can come apart. So Foote argues in her later work, so her sort of mature position is that acting morally, that is virtuous, is part of practical rationality. Her idea is that if we are good, non-defective human beings, then we will have reason to act in accordance with the virtues, namely justice, charity, courage, temperance, etc. Just as good, non-defective wolves will hunt with the pack rather than being a free rider. The virtues are understood here as qualities of character and of intellect that human beings, as rational social animals, characteristically need in order for things to go well. The virtues are, as she puts it, Aristotelian necessities. Although the virtues will often be in our light and self-interest, they may not always be, and so virtue and happiness can come apart. However, even in such cases, Foote maintains that human beings still have reason to act according to virtue, and this means that virtue can at times require us to engage in self-sacrificial activity, where we act for the benefit of others rather than for our own benefit. She writes, "Happiness is not the universal aim of action. Brave people choose great and immediate evils, such as certain death, in order to rescue or defend others. Even in their choice of life, some reject happiness for the sake of some other goal." She illustrates this point with the real-life case of the letter writers, who were courageous and deeply religious men and women who opposed the Nazis and so were separated from loved ones and eventually lost their lives. She writes of them, they did not see as their happiness what they could have got by giving in. Happiness in life was not something possible for them. So here she thinks this is a case where we can see that virtue and happiness come apart. However, on my view, I think it is best to interpret the letter writers as thinking not that happiness was impossible for them, but rather that the only happiness that was possible for them involved taking such a courageous stand. So again, if you take my account of the virtues as constitutive of happiness understood in terms of a meaningful life or worthwhile life, the question is, what kind of meaningful or worthwhile life was possible for them? And to live with integrity, what they experienced as demanded of them is that they couldn't go along with the Nazis, but nevertheless, this meant sacrificing real important goods, being parted from their loved ones, and being, ultimately losing their lives, right? And the image I have in the background, some of you may be familiar with, it's from the film A Hidden Life, which is about Franz Jagerstatter, who was a person who made such a choice, such a courageous stand for the sake of justice and following his conscience. And so I don't think we should say that happiness wasn't possible if we understand happiness as a meaningful life. So in taking this courageous stance, in fact, contributed to the meaningfulness of the life, but nevertheless, it was a life with great loss. So here, I want to distinguish my own position from certain Stoic views, such as that of John McDowell, who writes that no sacrifice necessitated by the life of excellence can count as a genuine loss. So that's essentially, I take it to be a Stoic position where all virtue is all we need for happiness. So full and complete happiness only requires virtue. We don't have to worry about sort of our external circumstances. I think this view fails to recognize the plurality of strong goods in our lives and how they can come into conflict, and how at times some strong goods must be sacrificed for the sake of others. And I think we can see this in the case of the letter writers. So John McDowell will, for instance, talk about how virtue will silence certain kinds of considerations. He thinks temperance as a virtue silences certain considerations about pleasure, sort of makes those considerations not count. And that seems, I think, plausible enough. But where he becomes less plausible is he'll talk about the virtue of courage silencing considerations of life and limb. And here, I don't think we can talk about silencing, because I think there is genuine loss. Courage may require us to sacrifice life and limb, but there is, in fact, genuine loss there. It's not as if it doesn't count at all. So, I mean, in that case, we have strong goods of life and bodily integrity that we ought to be concerned about. But in tragic circumstances, we may find that doing the courageous or the just action requires this kind of sacrifice. So I want a count of virtue and meaning in life that is going to account for this sort of loss and not go in this Stoic direction. To a certain extent, Aristotle also takes this line of approach. For instance, he says that there are cases of significant misfortune that oppress and spoil one's blessedness, since they involve pain and impede many activities. But he says that nobility still shines through when we nobly bear such misfortune by continuing to act virtuously. So while we may not have perfect happiness, there's still a sense of nobility. And so we may say there's still a degree of happiness there. However, he also says that there are rare cases of crushing loss where we cannot count a virtuous person as happy, such as the case of Priam. So people may come to just, a tragic ruin, and he thinks that we wouldn't be able to count that person as happy. Since Aristotle understands eudaimonia as a whole life assessment, the question arises whether we should say that anyone who comes to such an end has not lived a meaningful and worthwhile life. Should we necessarily think that it would have been better never to have been born rather than to suffer such a fate? This is a conclusion that I want to resist. I think a lot depends on how someone got into such a horrible situation. Sure. Perhaps a person got there because he or she lived a life of integrity and thought, what does it profit a person to gain the world but forfeit his soul, and therefore sought righteousness above all. So again, if we look back to the letter writers, right, they certainly came to a tragic end, right? But that doesn't mean their lives weren't worthwhile or weren't meaningful. In fact, their act of sacrifice, to follow their conscience, contributed to the meaningfulness of their life, right? And so that's the way in which I don't want to say that if we can say that happiness can be understood in terms of a meaningful life, then I think we can count the letter writers happy, right? And I want to say there is a sense in which every human life should be regarded as worthwhile, that there's something good about life. This requires taking a certain position on what I call the problem of cosmodicy. So again, the problem of cosmodicy is the problem of whether we can justify life in the world as meaningful and worthwhile in the face of evil and suffering. I think the greatest existential danger in the face of the misfortunes and horrors of human existence is that we can come to lose our grip on our strong evaluative framework altogether and experience a sense of existential vertigo or a sense of meaninglessness. We can come to think that the universe is pointless or meaningless, and therefore that our lives are pointless or meaningless. For those who have experienced such a loss, it does seem that happiness and virtue can come apart. So if you lose, this sort of strong evaluative framework altogether, where we experience goods as being there in any case, whether or not we're responsive to them, then I think that would mean that virtue and happiness would come apart. So I think it's especially in confronting crushing loss or horrible evil that we can see that the issue of strong evaluative meaning in life and a meaningful life cannot ultimately be separated from our views of the meaning of life. That is, on whether we can think that there is some ultimate or cosmic source of meaning by which we can find our place in the world. And it seems here that we need a conception of meaning, the meaning of life, that can support the life of virtue when the going gets tough. Okay, so that's sort of the first part of what I want to talk about here on the relationship between virtue, happiness, and meaning, and particularly as we face hardship or loss, how we still have reason to act virtuously, because the life of virtue in a meaningful life can include a place for loss. But I think this ultimately points to, as I'm saying, a need for a conception of the meaning of life. So let me now turn to look more at this issue. So I want to begin with Hursthouse and her three theses about the virtues. So Hursthouse is fairly representative of what I take to be the dominant approach to Aristotelian virtue ethics that focuses simply on human flourishing, understood on analogy with the flourishing of other living things, and doesn't account for sort of, at least in my view, doesn't sufficiently account for sort of the space of meaning within our human form of life that we inhabit. So she gives these three theses, the first of which is that the virtues benefit their possessor, that is, they enable us to be happy or to flourish as individuals. The second thesis is that the virtues make their possessor a good human being, that is, they enable us to flourish qua human being. And our third thesis is that these two claims are interrelated. She says it does not just happen to be the case that those character traits which benefit their human possessor, enabling her to live a satisfying and fulfilling life, coincide with those those character traits which are the good-making characteristics of human beings. They benefit her in this way because of her nature as a human being, the sort of rational social animals that we are. Again, the idea is that it's going to benefit us, the virtues are going to benefit us precisely because we are rational social animals, and the virtues make us good as rational social animals. So I'm appealing to Hursthouse here because I want to take on a challenge that she takes on from Bernard Williams, which is that once we've lost the teleological conception, if we're right to have lost that, which I want to contest, but Williams' view is that once we've lost a teleological understanding of the world, this poses problems for an Aristotelian outlook. So I want to look at a few passages from Bernard Williams. So the first here, Williams writes, the most plausible stories now available about human evolution, including its very recent date, and also certain considerations about the physical characteristics of the species, suggest that human beings are to some degree a mess, and that the rapid and immense development of symbolic and cultural capacities has left human beings as beings for which no form of life is likely to prove entirely satisfactory, either individually or socially. The idea of a naturalistic ethic, or naturalistic ethics of the sort endorsed by Aristotelians, was born of a deeply teleological outlook, and its best expression in many ways is still to be found in Aristotle's philosophy, a philosophy according to which there is inherent in each natural kind of thing an appropriate way for things of that kind to behave. On that view, it must be the deepest desire of human beings to live in the way that is in the objective sense appropriate to them. The first and hardest lesson of Darwinism, that there is no such teleology at all, and that there is no orchestral score provided from anywhere according to which human beings have a special part to play, still has to find its way fully into ethical thought. So two other passages here. Williams writes, the Aristotelian approach takes for granted a strong view of the harmony among themselves of human capacities and needs. This assumption does, I must confess, seem to me more plausible if you can help yourself to Aristotelian cosmology than if you regard it as an open question whether the evolutionary success of humanity in its extremely brief period of existence may not rest on a rather ill-sorted bricolage of powers and instincts, This is one reason why I still think that it makes a big difference to accepting Aristotle's ethical outlook that we cannot accept his cosmology. Lastly, he writes, this is from Shame and Necessity, we know that the world was not made for us or we for the world, that our history tells no purposive story, and that there is no position outside the world or outside of history from which we might hope to authenticate our activities. So we get the general sense that there's sort of no rhyme or reason, no cosmic support for the life of virtue. And if we look at human nature, it seems a bit of a mixed bag. So it's difficult to read, the sort of requirements of the virtues off of human nature. So as Williams will put it, our human nature seems to be underdetermined with respect to the ethical life. So Hursthouse responds to Williams by saying that such views are as old as misanthropy and despair, and taken seriously, they amount to moral nihilism. She argues that belief in the harmony of human nature is something that can only be vindicated from within an acquired ethical outlook, and thus we should not expect to convince the wicked and the moral skeptic of it. She writes, we manifest this belief when we try to inculcate the virtues in our children. We manifest it when we try to make ourselves, as we think, better people and try to improve our own and other people's ethical views. We manifest it when we try to bring about social change. We manifest it by going in for ethical thought and talk at all. She also acknowledges the fact, if it is a fact, that human nature is at best harmonious, is a highly contingent one. It is a contingent fact, if it is a fact, that we can individually flourish or achieve eudaimonia, contingent that we can do so in the same way as each other, in virtue of possessing the same set of character traits, and contingent that we can all do so together, not at each other's expense. If things had been otherwise, ethics would not exist, or we would be unimaginably different. In the end, Hursthouse maintains that belief in the harmony of human nature is a matter of hope, but she says hope as a virtue is not without its own validation, insofar as it is a necessary condition for moral education, moral improvement, and moral theorizing, and insofar as from within an ethical outlook, the facts about human nature and the way life goes seem to support the claim that the virtues benefit their possessor and allow a reading of human history that ascribes our persisting failure to achieve eudaimonia in anything but very small patches to our vices. So here we see, while many Aristotelians, take this observer standpoint, want to compare human flourishing to the flourishing of other living things, here Hursthouse does think we need to try to inhabit a particular ethical outlook and see things from within that standpoint. And one of my complaints is that this move doesn't go far enough in taking account of the realm of meaning. So 2 replies to Hursthouse. First, to ascribe our persisting failure to achieve eudaimonia to our vices does not really answer Williams' challenge. Hursthouse is trying to avoid the view that our nature is intrinsically flawed. But the question arises, what explains the propensity to vice throughout human history? One might want to blame it on bad education and bad social institutions, but these themselves would need to be explained. It seems difficult to avoid the conclusion that the propensity to vice is in some way rooted in our human nature, just as is the propensity to virtue. In short, it suggests that our nature is indeed a mixed bag, though we might not want to go as far as describing it as a mess, and so we need some way of coming to terms with this. The second point that needs to be made in response to the seemingly untroubled way in which Hursthouse acknowledges the contingency of ethics. This fails to appreciate an important problem that Williams identifies with regard to acknowledging the radical contingency of our ethical beliefs, where these beliefs are seen as being entirely dependent on the contingencies of our personal, cultural, and evolutionary histories. Williams writes, this sense of contingency seems to be in tension with something that our ethical ideas themselves demand, a recognition of their authority. In other words, the normative authority of ethics, as commonly understood, seems to carry with it a sense of necessity that is at odds with seeing our ethical beliefs as radically contingent. For instance, as ethical agents, we do not typically experience it as a contingent fact that we should pursue kindness and compassion over dominance and cruelty, but rather we see it as something categorical. That is, we ought to pursue kindness and compassion over dominance and cruelty, irrespective of what we happen to desire. To give up this sort of normativity means that only a significantly reduced form of ethics remains possible, and one that I don't think can affirm the Aristotelian view of a strong correlation between virtue and happiness, where in my view, again, virtue is constitutive of happiness. As John Cottingham puts it, to play its necessary guiding role, human nature has to mean more than just a collection of contingent facts about the sort of creatures we human beings have evolved to be. Instead, it has to embody a normative ideal of what is noblest and best within us. So here I want to take on another important neo-Aristotelian philosopher who criticizes the sort of dominant approach that we find in Foote and Hursthouse, and this is John McDowell. So John McDowell endorses a form of second nature naturalism, where we need to understand our ethical demands as arising out of our upbringing within a particular ethical outlook. So John McDowell argues for a quietist position that maintains that we don't need to appeal to any, quote, grand teleological scheme or conception of the meaning of life in order to identify what is noblest and best in our humanity. All we need is a decent upbringing that can open our eyes to the demands of the noble. This is a matter of acquiring a second nature, that is, cultivated forms of thought, action, and sensitivity. So it's a quietism because it wants to set aside these sort of grand questions or sort of issue of, what kind of moral ontology, as I want to call it, supports our moral phenomenology. It's enough that our eyes have been opened to the demands of the noble. We don't need to try to provide any sort of deeper metaphysical grounding for our ethical beliefs. However, my response is that McDowell often writes as though living the life of virtue is simply a matter of developing a kind of sensitivity to certain situations in which one can just see that courageous actions are required in certain fearful situations, kind acts are required in situations where someone is in need, and so forth. But why courage and kindness should be seen as virtues, that is, as part of a normatively higher mode of life, and why other human beings are worthy of our concern is left unexplained. McDowell discusses the need for reflective self-scrutiny of one's ethical outlook, but is not clear what this involves beyond seeking a kind of internal coherence, namely in avoiding contradictions. It seems that the most he wants to say is that if one's ethical outlook hangs together in a coherent scheme of life, then that is surely some reason to suppose that the perceptions of this ethical outlook are veridical. But this judgment of veridicality is quite underdetermined without some background ontology that can make sense of the claim that there are ethical demands that are there in any case, whether or not we are responsive to them. We might then wonder why for McDowell articulating such a background ontology is not part of what is required to achieve internal coherence. This underdetermination, in fact, seems to be a necessary feature of his quietist position. But is it sufficient in the face of the challenge that someone like Williams can pose here? Can we make sense of the claim that there are ethical demands that are there in any case, whether or not we're responsive to them, in a world devoid of any underlying moral teleology? And so that's a key question. And so here we're brought to question whether we should go along with Williams. Is Williams right to deny that there is any sort of teleological worldview that's possible? And certainly, I think Williams finds some support by fairly prominent scientists. For instance, Jacques Monod writes, "It is perfectly true that science outrages value. If we accept the message of science in its full significance, we must at last awake out of our millenary dream and discover our total solitude, our fundamental isolation. We must realize that we live on the boundary of an alien world, a world that is deaf to our music as it is indifferent to our hopes and our sufferings and crimes." So this is sort of Jacques Monod channeling a bit of Jean-Paul Sartre. But we see something similar with Weinberg, who writes, "The worldview of science is rather chilling. Not only do we not find any point to life laid out for us in nature, no objective basis for our moral principles, no correspondence between what we think is the moral law and the laws of nature. We even learn that the emotions that we most treasure, a love for our spouses and children, are as a result of are made possible by chemical processes in our brains that are what they are as a result of natural selection, acting on chance mutation over millions of years. And yet we must not sink into nihilism or stifle our emotions. At best, we must live on a knife edge between wishful thinking on one hand and on the other, despair." It's a pretty tight knife edge there, difficult to walk. And then lastly, Dawkins writes, "The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." So as I said, one can certainly find support for something like something like Williams' perspective, where he thinks Darwinism has just made impossible the idea that there could be any underlying teleology in the world. However, there are others who take a different view, and you see this in discussions around fine-tuning. So, for instance, Freeman Dyson writes, this is in contrast to Jacques Monod, that I do not feel like an alien in this universe. The more I examine this universe and study the details of its architecture, the more evidence I find that the universe must, in some sense, have known that we were coming. Paul Davies writes something similar when he talks about the universe seems to be about something. So when we look at the facts of life and intelligence, we need to explain. There needs to be something about the universe that explains how this came to be. In short, the universe, the laws of nature, the constants of physics, and the initial conditions of the universe appear to be fine-tuned for the emergence of life and consciousness, and ultimately for intelligent beings such as ourselves. Or if some have described it, the universe appears to be biophilic and noophilic. The universe is by its nature apt to produce life and intelligence. So part of what I'm suggesting here is that there is a possibility of a way of thinking about the meaning of life here in sort of a cosmic sense of purpose. And so the question is, what should we make of this appearance of fine-tuning? And just to go briefly through some of the dominant options here, one view is the dumb luck view, as we can call it. According to this view, it is purely a cosmic accident that we are here at all. We are just what the cosmic cat coughed up, so to speak. In other words, we are the result of blind mechanistic processes, and it is sheer dumb luck that we are here at all. Of course, speaking of luck presumes that we think it is a good thing that we are here. The problem with this response is that the apparent fine-tuning of the universe seems extremely lucky on scientific naturalist grounds. One might even be tempted to say that it seems miraculous. The apparent extreme improbability that our universe, presuming non-theism and that our universe is the only universe there is, should have just the right conditions for life and conscious intelligence to emerge, seems to call out for some explanation as opposed to just declaring it dumb luck. Another response is, of course, the multiverse hypothesis. This view questions the presumption that our universe is the only universe there is. The basic idea here is that the more universes there are, the less improbable it is that at least one universe would strike gold and have just the right conditions for the emergence of life and conscious intelligent beings such as ourselves. As the astrophysicist Martin Rees puts it, the cosmos maybe has something in common with an off-the-shelf clothes shop. If the shop has a large stock, we're not surprised to find one suit that fits. Likewise, if our universe is selected from a multiverse, it's seemingly designed or fine-tuned features wouldn't be surprising. Rees admits that it is a rather speculative proposal, though he maintains that it's still a scientific one. The response to this is that it seems to push the fine-tuning problem back to whatever it is that generated these universes. This universe generator, it seems, would have to be fine-tuned so that at least one universe gave rise to life and conscious intelligence. And we also don't have any sort of observable data to know that there are multiple universes. There's also the grand unified theory view, which says that there's only one recipe to life. I'm just going to go through this sort of quickly since I don't want to continue on too much longer. The sort of response to this is to say it seems curious that if there's one recipe to life, that it should be one that's sort of suitable to life and to conscious intelligent beings such as ourselves. This still seems to cry out for some kind of explanation. So here, lastly, we come to certain teleological views. And this I'm thinking particularly associated with Thomas Nagel's book, Mind and Cosmos, where mindedness or idea and purpose are fundamental, but they are immanent within the natural world. This view questions the blind mechanistic causal stories of the dumb luck and multiverse views. According to this perspective, we can see the fine-tuning of the universe as an expression of a fundamental purposiveness of the universe, even without God. The challenge here is whether we can find cosmic purpose, whether or not seeing cosmic purpose in the universe requires some purposive being. Is this like finding a watch without the watchmaker? Does this make sense? So I think that's the challenge. I don't want to rule it out. So I think this would be a kind of Platonism where, again, purpose or idea, mindedness are somehow fundamental to the world, but without necessarily requiring a purposive being. And Nagel will talk about how the universe comes to consciousness in human life, how we're here to sort of understand the world. I think you can find expressions of this. So I have a couple quotations, one from John Updike and one from Annie Dillard. John Updike writes, "The ancient religions and modern science agree. We are here to give praise, or to slightly tip the expression, to pay attention. Without us, the physicists who have espoused the anthropic principle tell us the universe would be unwitnessed and in a real sense not there at all. It exists incredibly for us. I'll just skip on to Annie Dillard. She writes, "We are here to witness the creation and to abet it. We are here to notice each thing so that each thing gets noticed." I think that's a beautiful line, that we are here to notice each thing so that each thing gets noticed. So I think we can find, if we can come to believe that this is a compelling picture that of a non-theistic cosmic teleological view, then I think this could support the life of virtue. This could, seeing life as having a purpose, could give us compelling reasons to sort of fulfill our rational and social nature, and seeing that there are ethical demands that are there in any case. However, if we can't find the idea that of ultimate purpose without a purpose of being compelling, then either it seems like we'd have to reject that teleological view, or else we have to accept something like a theistic view. And so this is from John Cottingham. He writes, "If there is at least the possibility of a theistic interpretation of reality, this would open a way for our lives to have meaning in a strong sense that would leave far behind mere local satisfaction of our contingent wants. It would provide a model of fulfillment that would locate our human destiny within an enduring moral framework. So far from being a cosmic accident or byproduct of blind forces, our lives would be seen as having a purpose, that of attuning ourselves to a creative order that is inherently good. Our deepest responses would be seen as pointing us towards such a goal, and our deepest fulfillment to be obtained in realizing it. The religious or theistic perspective offers a possibility of meaningfulness, providing a powerful normative framework or focus for the life of virtue, namely where love is seen as creation's final law. What the religious dimension adds is a framework within which human nature is revealed as more than just a set of characteristics that a certain species happens intermittently to possess, but instead is pointing us to the condition that a being of the utmost benevolence and care that we can conceive of desires us to achieve. Focusing on this dimension, moreover, encourages us with the hope that the pursuit of virtue, difficult and demanding though it often is, contributes, however minutely, to the establishment of a moral order that the cosmos was created to realize." So ultimately, I think I don't know that one can make a sort of conclusive knockdown argument when you're talking about these sort of cosmic questions or issues of our cosmic outlook. In part, we're sort of driven to this by our moral responses, but also I think this discussion of fine-tuning provides some background framework from which we could find it plausible that the world is a moral order, has a moral teleology built into it. But the thing I want to bring out here is that I think if we can't affirm something like this, or the non-theistic teleological outlook, either a theistic or a non-theistic cosmic teleological outlook, then I do think we sort of fall back to something like Williams' perspective of the radical contingency of ethics. So here again, I think ultimately a viable virtue ethic perspective requires us to raise certain questions of ultimate meaning that many contemporary Aristotelians have not been willing or comfortable raising, but nevertheless, I have sought to raise those here today. And thank you very much for your time and listening to this talk. Thank you.